Thanks for dropping along tonight at Terrace 47, and to our people who are following this on Zoom and will follow it later on TV and YouTube. Thanks for attending tonight. Daniel Walton makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He was here previously in the lock-up period, and we did basically a talk with no one in the room, and we ran that as a film because we weren't allowed to have people in the room at the time. But on this occasion, he's back with a live audience, and the topic is why critical minerals are now critical to Australia's sovereignty. And I'll introduce our speaker very briefly. He's National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union. Before that, he was the Vice President of the AWU. Before that, he worked with Unions New South Wales. He's one of Australia's leading union figures, and he's talking, and we're very pleased to have him here tonight. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gerard, and thanks for the opportunity. I just want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to past elders, present and emerging. In doing so, I think last time I had the great pleasure of coming to speak to the Sydney Institute, there were very little interjections and only a few questions. So I welcome the warm bodies in the room tonight and certainly welcome any questions at the end of this speech. And it is a great honour. Clearly for most of you have probably noticed that there's been a fair bit of an announcement around not just this speech, but for me personally as well, soon to depart the AWU after about 15 years here. And it is a great pleasure to be here tonight to hopefully put forward a big policy initiative that our union and hopefully the Labor movement can get behind going forward, but one that no doubt will be met with some fierce opposition as well. So thank you. As I said, I think for me personally, this is probably the perfect forum to lay out for the first time what I believe is certainly a new position for our union. And for those of you who don't know, we were formed around in 1886, and the AWU has always held a view that to truly advocate for our members' interests and indeed for Australian workers in general, we must be active in the policy debate. And although historically we were intertwined with the Australian Labor Party, we are certainly not one and the same. And so when we believe that the Labor government is at risk of taking the wrong path, we believe we have a responsibility to speak up. And it's for this reason that I want to speak to everyone today. And our union is the most diverse union in the country, and we're lucky to have members across a range of industries, from airports to hospitals to fisheries to factories. And a very significant portion of our members are engaged in mining. Traditionally, the bulk of this mining has been iron ore, along with bauxite, gold, nickel, copper and uranium. And our members also drill for natural gas, both onshore and offshore. More and more, however, the focus of mining is shifting to so-called critical minerals. And now, critical minerals is a term that you hear bandied around a lot, but few actually stop to consider the definition. You probably know that they include rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and other strategic metals. But the reasons that they're accurately described as critical is for two reasons. Because one, they are critical and irreplaceable to key industries, especially new green key industries like battery manufacturing, solar panels and wind turbines. And two, that their supply chain is at risk due to limited geographic distribution and geopolitical tensions. Few nations have them, but if a nation does not have access to them or the products they create, they're in big trouble. This makes critical minerals critical to global security. And Australia is a critical mineral stronghold. I don't think we've internalised this properly as a nation. And my fear is that we are miscategorising the critical minerals boom as just another mining boom like the last one. And my fear is that the government sees its role as just setting basic terms for multinationals to dig up these minerals as fast as they please so they can ship them wherever they want. Now, during the most recent boom that focused on iron ore, coal and gas, that kind of lazy approach was just misguided. But it will be catastrophic if we take the same approach with critical minerals. Catastrophic not just to our economy, but to our national interests. But also catastrophic to our global security. And that's why today I want to argue we cannot fiddle around with the edges of policy here. If we are truly to recognise the importance of our critical minerals wealth, if we are to truly understand Australia's opportunity and Australia's responsibility here, then we need to square up to the fact that a major shift in policy is required, and it's required now. So I want to lay out the case for why change is necessary and present a major policy shift and what I think is necessary to drive it. Obviously, the idea of getting more economic boom for our buck from our mineral wealth is not a new one. Indeed, it's an idea I've spoken about here before. But since the 1980s, it's an idea that has faced fierce criticism from free marketeers. They claim Australia's decisions should just be guided by the market. If the market wants Australia to dig materials up here, but wants China to make those materials into manufactured goods, well, you need to focus on the bit the market says you're good at. Now, for the past 40 years, with the US in unquestionable ascendancy as the sole global superpower, you could position yourself on either side of the divide on economic and social justice grounds. But in recent years, some very important geopolitical pieces have begun to shift that change the equation entirely. I was in the United States earlier this year meeting with a range of fascinating people, some connected to manufacturing. And I was curious to learn how they're recovering post-COVID. And having heard so much about the Biden's administration's Inflation Reduction Act, I was keen to see how it was working on the ground. And I was truly astonished at the transformation that was taking place. Companies and investment and jobs are flying back into the US manufacturing at an incredible pace. Companies that fled in the 80s and 90s are now rushing to come back in. The likes of Volkswagen, Samsung, Siemens have all recently announced plans to manufacture things like equipment for clean power facilities and car batteries for EVs inside the United States. Brookfield and Intel have announced they'll be building 2 chip manufacturing facilities worth $30 billion. These companies are now able to plan ahead. They know the tax incentives they find attractive will be broadly available, they will be long-term, and they will be technology neutral. So it's really not the government picking winners, it's the government laying a foundation. It's the government very consciously selecting the rules of the game to suit the national interest. As a result, companies producing green tech are propping up everywhere. The core of the Inflation Reduction Act is an ambitious industrial policy. Its purpose is to strengthen manufacturing, hasten a green energy transformation, create well-paid jobs and ensure American technological leadership over China. To be reductionist, the policy essentially consists of federal tax credits, government grant programs and infrastructure projects for hydrogen, for critical minerals, for high-tech renewable products and for electric cars. In terms of ambition, it's not quite the New Deal, but it has created a fundamentally new way using the government's muscle to shape, prod and mobilise the economy in certain directions. And it's clearly Joe Biden's baby. He could have appointed a single industry czar to oversee things, but instead he's taken the initiative himself, leading what he refers to as an Invest America cabinet. The rationale for the Inflation Reduction Act has been driven by 3 key factors, and they are factors that every Australian minister should have stapled to their wall. Number 1, the rise of China and the extent to which it has used non-market practices to strengthen its competitive position in key economic areas. And number 2, the COVID pandemic, which illustrated the supply chain vulnerabilities that the US economy faces after a decade of offshoring. And 3, climate change, which demands a rapid transformation of energy production and transportation. The policy aims to drive economic growth, and so far that seems like it is working. It also isn't cheap. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts that IRA's energy and climate provisions would cost around $391 billion between 2022 and 2031. But this is unlikely to be an underestimate. The tax credits it provides aren't capped, and they are not exactly being tightly administered either. But it's clearly a cost the United States believes is worth it. Now, nothing is certain in the crazy world of US politics, but you would have to be very brave to confidentially predict that a Republican administration in 2024 would necessarily be rushing to dismantle the IRA. Trump-style protectionism was deeply popular with the Republican base, and the IRA is far more sophisticated, but it also appeases it also pleases a lot of the same voters. Of course, the United States has faced criticism for the IRA. And although the Biden administration insists that it does not constitute protectionism, many in the EU disagree. Europe has even sought to report the US to the WTO. Although it is worth noting that the EU is now considering a similar IRA-style initiative itself. But although what the Biden administration is doing certainly does not fit the picture of free trade envisioned in the 1980s, it would be wrong to think of it as isolationist. The resurgence of American manufacturing is not a zero-sum game. By fostering a robust and competitive domestic market, opportunities are created for international collaboration and mutually beneficial trade. Yet no matter where you sit, booster or detractor, it is clear the Inflation Reduction Act is a fundamental game changer. The US has signalled it is willing to use its unparalleled might to start driving manufacturing investment onshore. When the 800-pound gorilla in the room switches tack like this, everyone is compelled to recognise things have changed. Which brings me to Australia. Here we sit on the verge of a major economic shift ourselves. For a generation, our economy has benefited from an unprecedented mining boom, primarily coal, gas and iron ore. But just as we feared might be coming to the end of one mining boom, demand for critical minerals suddenly shot sky high and is predicted to only get higher. We are the world's largest producer of lithium, which is crucial in batteries. Processed lithium components are crucial for virtually all batteries. It is lithium that moves from the cathode to the anode of the battery through a lithium-salt electrolyte while the battery is being discharged. Putting electricity back into the battery moves that lithium ions back the other way, charging it up. These are the batteries that go into our phones, into our electric vehicles, and into our stationary mass community batteries. So lithium exports have been growing at an incredible rate. 1.1 billion in 2021 to almost 14 billion in 2022-2023. And more of that growth is forecast over future years. In a 2021 report, the International Energy Agency forecasts world lithium demand to grow 14 times over its current size in the next 20 years, from 73,000 tonnes today to 1.16 million tonnes in 2040. We also have the third largest reserves of cobalt, fourth largest for rare earth elements, and fifth largest reserves of nickel. And although they are not officially deemed critical minerals, the government's new National Critical Minerals Strategy, we are also global leaders in the mining of copper, bauxite and zinc. Both copper and bauxite are deemed critical minerals by the European Commission, while bauxite and zinc make it onto the US list. Technological advances and military expansion will drive booming demand for battery minerals, rare earth elements, and materials essential to high-end electronics. Indeed, demand for some of these materials is forecast to increase more than tenfold, creating new multi-billion-dollar global industries. A global deployment of large-scale battery systems will be needed to manage the growing reliance on intermittent energy sources. Consequently, future opportunities in critical minerals supply are enormous. Without Australia's resources, the world will not reach net zero. Renewable energy is dependent on critical minerals. Wind turbines need copper, rare earth elements and nickel. Solar panels use large amounts of silicon, silver and gallium, and battery storage technologies are relying on lithium, nickel, cobalt and manganese. The emerging hydrogen industry is also material intensive and will require large amounts of platinum, copper, nickel and rare earth elements. Small wonder that mining companies and governments hungry for royalties are licking their lips. Flick through the business pages in any given week and you'll see no shortage of folk getting breathless and excited about the windfalls that await these minerals. But simply digging these precious minerals up and loading them onto ships is an incredibly limited way to view the opportunity. Because historically it is manufacturing capability that is a hallmark of all successful economies. Manufacturing supplies a nation with advanced goods, creates greater employment opportunities, and stimulates innovation. It makes an economy more robust and resilient to shocks, and Australia has been falling further and further behind on this metric for generations. This decline is born out of the Harvard University's country and productivity complexity rankings. These rankings measure an ability of a country to make products and deliver it to customers, or put another way, the complexity and sophistication of a national economy. In 1995, Australia was ranked 55th. By 2019, we'd fallen to 86, the lowest ranked and biggest fall of any G20 country. Over the last 45 years, rather than protect and build our manufacturing capabilities, Australian policy left it to market forces. But even with our very inefficient methods of taxing the profits being generated by mining companies, governments were still able to collect so many billions that it glossed over the opportunity cost. So we allowed our manufacturing base to decline, and we outsourced that work to regions paying the lowest wages. We lost jobs, a critical source of productivity driving innovation, and with some business closures, a source of national pride. As a result, our workforce has become more focused in major metropolitan centres. Jobs in the service industries tend to be more concentrated in major cities, while the manufacturing industries they have replaced were more dispersed across regional Australia. This has had a secondary effect of reducing economic diversity in regional Australia, with many areas now more reliant on agriculture and mining than ever before. And while mining was undeniably driving growth in GDP, it failed to provide the proportionate boost to employment. It didn't have to be this way, of course. Australia could have expanded its mining industry in response to the rapid growth in world demand for resources, but used the same minerals produced to drive expansion in downstream industries that process the minerals in Australia. That would have created new jobs for thousands of workers and business opportunities across regional Australia. Instead, these value-adding opportunities were exported for other nations. For example, Australians invented much of the technology used in solar panels, and we were an early leader. But China took the global lead position in manufacturing from us, which now looks unassailable. Essentially, every tonne of unprocessed ore exported from Australia creates revenue, but it also comes with an opportunity cost. A job in metal manufacturing that wasn't created, a downstream supply opportunity not provided, an energy sector not expanded, and an innovation ecosystem not supported. Now, I represent a national union, and my core interest is the quality of Australian jobs. So this alone would be motivation to care about doing better with critical minerals than we did with our last mining boom. But the fact is, there is actually more than jobs to worry about. The situation in the 2020s is very different to the 1990s. Because while we may be the world's biggest supplier of lithium, we only have pretty much one customer. 96% of Australia's lithium is going to China. There, it is being used to make components, which, in turn, is being used in batteries, solar panels, and military equipment. We assume that China will always be happy to sell us and our allies these components at a reasonable price. But we do that at the same time as we openly canvass the potential for tension. It's an awkward dynamic, to say the very least. And while the mining execs in the C-suites may tell us there's nothing to worry about, everyone else seems to understand that there's a potential problem brewing here. A few weeks ago, the Resource Minister, Madeleine King, announced that the government would be shifting position so that only like-minded foreign investors would be welcome to invest in Australia critical minerals projects. Ms King stopped well short of suggesting Chinese investment would be banned outright, but she did signal that Chinese investment in Australia critical mineral mines was something the government very much had its eye on. Indeed, Treasurer Jim Chalmers went a step further in March when he prevented a major supplier of minerals into China from taking a bigger stake in Australian rare earth aspirants, Northern Minerals. But here's what I think the government might be missing. Our primary concern should not be who is investing in our mines. Our primary concern should be where the products of those mines are going and how that is affecting the world. Should Australia really be using its dominance in global lithium to boost China's dominance in battery tech? Although we all hope the relations between China and the US will remain peaceful, we also have to recognise the possibility that things could turn hot. And if that were to happen, the global supply chains of which Australia relies are suddenly all in jeopardy. We got a taste of this during COVID. We realised how completely reliant we had become on imports from China to function. Now, we managed to escape the situation relatively lightly. But it should certainly prompt the question, how much do we trust China to keep supporting the Australian national interest? And if push comes to shove, do we seriously expect they will put our national interests ahead of theirs? Think about the assumptions in a way we are approaching things right now. The federal government, for example, has talked a lot about its ambitions for Australia to manufacture batteries at scale. It's a fantastic initiative. But to make those batteries in Australia, you need to import a lot of componentry that is made in China. That componentry is made from Australian critical minerals. Now, if Australia starts making batteries that rival China, do we think that China will be happy to keep selling us the components we need? Do we really want to assume that we can keep digging up critical minerals, shipping them to China for processing, and then China will just keep shipping them back to us to manufacture batteries? It's a bet I don't feel too confident on. We know how China operates. They do and will likely continue to take a long-term view about dominating markets, and that's their prerogative, but we should not be blind to it. There is no free market here. And Australia certainly can't wish one into existence through our example. The solution, of course, is not Australia becoming self-sufficient, but nor is it resigning ourselves to being impotent. A change in perspective is necessary. We should stop looking at critical minerals as just a cash pinata. They are a global critical resource which we need to steward not just in the national interest, but in the interests of global security. If we continue just to let the market rule, it will mean only one thing. Australia's raw materials will be shipped off to China, and China will be the only player in the region with a sovereign capacity to turn them into anything useful. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US has fundamentally changed the equation. If America is not lashing itself to the master free trade orthodoxy, why should anyone else? So should we simply copy the US approach and introduce an Australian version of the IRA? We should recognise that the US is uniquely placed here. As the world's largest economy, it can use its raw economic heft and scale to force investment in manufacturing capacity through subsidies. Australia is not in the same position to call the shots like this. But what we do have is a big chunk of the world's critical minerals within our sovereign soil. And that's our leverage. And we would be absolute fools not to use it. We know demand from the world for our critical minerals is astronomical. We have the power to create the rules under which they can have them. So if we have this hand, what should we be aiming to achieve? I think it's relatively straightforward. We want our critical minerals to deliver tax revenue, hundreds of thousands of quality jobs, a safer world in which Australia and its friends have the capacity to manufacture the products we need to survive and thrive. Our business as usual approach, as it stands, would deliver only the first of these three. So how do we get the trifecta? Well, what we can't do is simply ask nicely and pump some modest incentives into the market. That we know will 100% end in failure. I know the government has a stated goal of building more critical mineral processing and battery manufacturing capacity on Australian soil. And they've committed $2 billion to a critical minerals facility administered by the Export Finance to Australia, not to mention a $1 billion value adding in the broader resources industry under the National Reconstruction Fund. But this is nowhere near enough for a domestic investment in what will probably be the most important resources and manufacturing play this country will make, not just in this decade, but all the way up to 2050 and beyond. I know those ambitions will be a major part of the critical mineral strategy due for publication later this year. But let's be clear, we won't just need an incremental change here. Treasury does have access to enough carrots to encourage the change we need here. We need to get the stick out. I'm actually pretty amazed that no one else has called this, but I'm happy to. We need to apply a significant punitive tax on the export of raw critical minerals from Australia. And we need the revenue raised to be pumped directly back into subsidies for the manufacturing and processing on critical minerals onshore. Basically, we need to be using our sovereign ownership of these minerals to apply pressure from both ends. The tax needs to be big enough that gives multinationals pause. A flat volumetric tax of $1 a tonne, for example, would probably be sufficient enough to encourage a shift from export to domestic processing at the margin. It would accept that we are a price taker for our commodities, but it would encourage companies to stop and think about whether they could save by doing domestic processing, especially if that processing is subsidised by the government. And the payoff could be massive. Based on the International Energy Agency's forecast for critical mineral demand, if we could process and refine just half of critical mineral ores we already take out of the ground here in Australia, we could more than double the number of people employed in the sector, going from 18,000 today to 48,000 in 2030 and over 90,000 by 2040. If we aimed for 100%, as a number of other countries are seeking to do, then direct employment would go even further. We will have thousands of workers leaving the coal power generation sector in the coming decade. We don't want to throw these workers on the scrap heap, and we know that manufacturing jobs can provide stable, secure, well-paid, quality jobs that make use of their trades and their skills. Simultaneously, we need to bring up thousands of new engineers, fitters and other trades to get these plants off the ground and operate them. If we want to sustain the job growth we anticipate in areas like aged care, we need to boost our GDP. We need these kinds of jobs. If we do this well, there is no reason we couldn't be looking at Australia becoming a manufacturing powerhouse for a range of fundamental components. For example, we can and should be expanding cathode material production, which involves mixing lithium compounds with other metals like cobalt, manganese or iron, followed by high temperature calcination. China is the largest producer of cathode materials, while Japan and South Korea also have production capacity. In turn, cathode materials, along with other components like anode materials, separators and electrolytes, are used to assemble battery cells. This process basically involves precise layering and engineering of components to create a fundamental battery cell. China, South Korea and Japan are the dominant players in battery cell manufacturing, while the United States and Europe are working to expand their production facilities. There is zero reason we could not be a big player in this space. And if we do, there would be opportunities to expand into battery pack assembly, where battery cells are assembled into battery packs or modules, which are then integrated into electric vehicles. Right now, this stage of the supply chain is distributed across various countries, with automakers assembling battery packs in their manufacturing facilities. China, the United States and Europe are major players in battery pack assembly. Australia should bite off a piece of the action. I know if the government did the right thing and adopted this as a policy, they would encounter all the usual arguments from the usual quarters. You can't tax your way out of prosperity. Governments will always fail when they interfere with the market. If you raise this tax, you'll drive all investment offshore. I say let these arguments come because they are yesterday's arguments. Many US trade partners are viewing the IRA's new approach as an opportunity to make the most of friendshoring. And early signs are that the US will negotiate with their trade partners to permit use of similar approaches in their own countries. For example, the European Union has negotiated that vehicles manufactured in its country will be permitted to access tax credits without supply chain changes, and subsequently announced its intention to establish its own production incentives similar to those in the IRA. Australia can be part of this. We can be smart about it and boost our own economy without alienating ourselves from our friends around the globe. We recently signed a minerals security partnership which includes Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Commission. There is ample room to work within this alliance instead of bluntly allowing third parties just dig up our lithium and to sell it to a non-group member. In fact, what I am suggesting today, a significant tax on critical mineral exports, is not even remotely close by global standards as being extreme. Joko Widodo in Indonesia, for example, recently straight up banned exports of Indonesian nickel. Widodo recognised that nickel is crucial in EV battery manufacturing. But he wanted the manufacturing jobs, not just the royalties. And it's paying dividends with growing foreign investment and downstream processing and refining. Tax holidays and other incentives are also aimed at luring makers and turning Indonesia into an EV manufacturing hub. South Korea's Hyundai announced this month it was stepping up production of its best-selling all-electric vehicle in Indonesia from its assembly plant in West Java, with plans to export around the region as EV sales in Southeast Asia and Australia take off. If you are lucky enough to have critical minerals this century, you would have to be completely foolish not to try and leverage it to help your economy and your strategic interests. The task of getting this right has fallen to the Albanese government. I say that's lucky because I would have little faith in the previous government to get this right. But we're a long way of where we need to be. I will be urging my friends in government that they need to move boldly here. And the AW will be putting forward for further amendments to the ALP platform at the next National Policy Forum at the end of June. The amendment would formally commit Labor to imposing a tax on unprocessed exports of critical minerals and establish a production subsidy scheme to foster domestic mining, processing and component manufacturing from critical minerals. The government should embrace this change. And they should ignore the bleeding of vested interests and outdated ideologies. I have no doubt the current government will make a range of pivotal decisions in the years ahead that will define its legacy. But I don't think any will be more significant than the approach it decides to take with our special critical mineral wealth. Thank you so much.
Well, many thanks to Daniel Walton for a challenging speech tonight. So we come to questions and discussions. So if you just come back here, Mr. Walton, we will proceed.
I always sound like I'm in trouble when you say it like that.
You made the point, I think when Chris Bowen spoke to us a couple of months ago, he made the point that 90% or over 90% of solar panels in Australia are produced in China.
Yep.
And you made the point that we let some of the technology there. But as you know, one of the reasons why we had the technology and they did the processing was that we're a relatively high wage country and they're a very low wage country. So how many subsidies are involved in this, in changing that to the situation where our labour markets are competitive with a prospering industry along the kind that you've spoken about? You just speak to the end of the room.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. Undoubtedly, Australia has a higher labour cost in comparison to a lot of the Asian region. But there are a number of proponents who are trying to set up battery manufacturing facilities here with our labour costs, and they can see an opportunity with close proximity to our raw materials and our rare earths to be able to work through that value chain in a secure democracy to then be able to sell those products abroad. They are also having a look at building partnerships with AUKUS allies to be able to supply to key industries. There's one called Recharge Industries, which is looking to set up down in Geelong and supply batteries to the likes of India, UK, US, etc. They are able to do it with our current wage costs. The bit that we know is the government, and I've seen this in many areas, doesn't look more than 2 minutes ahead of them. And governments of all persuasions have done this. If you look in terms of what happened with gas, it's a perfect example where we basically allowed complete export of all of our gas and we end up paying more for our gas than what our overseas customers do. And so if you look ahead into the future, every nation who has rare earths and critical minerals know that they need to have some control of your supply chain. If you don't have supply, like if you don't process it onshore, you don't have that security. So there's a capacity here to be able to say we're going to tax the unprocessed ores to give the subsidies to be able to get those operations set up and established. And if you speak to a lot of manufacturers of base metals, of which the AW represents a lot, they can operate in our current labour market quite successfully. The challenge is if we give all of that advantage, like we did our iron ore, like we do with our bauxite and alumina, China gets that advantage to become this dominant superpower and then you can't win it back. What we're trying to say now is we're at the earliest stages of this. If we make the right decisions now, then we can hopefully change the direction and create a more stable manufacturing base to produce these critical things going forward.
So, there's a question down the back. Before we get to it, got to get a microphone down the back. Just come forward here again. You spoke towards the end of your speech about the impact of the AWU on the forthcoming Labor conference. So how many delegates do you have? What sort of weight does the AWU have these days? I mean, historically, it's had a huge amount of weight within the Labor Party. What about contemporary?
Well, I think right now we've been really successful in leading sensible policy debate, and as a consequence, I think we've got respect across factional lines. In the past, there's always been really, really strong divide in terms of everything was decided by a factional basis. But I think we've been able to lead a lot of policy initiatives which captures the imagination of the party as a whole. And I think this would go a long way to crossing the divide of the left and right and winning enough support to hopefully get this change up.
Hello. All of this depends upon the ongoing green transition from coal to solar and wind. Now the question is, are you aware of the phenomenon of wind droughts, which are periods up to 3 days when there's next to no wind across the whole of southeastern Australia? And following from that, the fact that with those droughts there's no way to make a transition from our coal power in the foreseeable future, and we need all of it we've got until maybe nuclear is up. And we'll find that out when another coal power station closes, when blackouts become a regular event.
Yeah, I think for those who don't know, I think I've probably advocated more about energy security in this country than just about anyone else. I would say over the last decade, it is something which is of enormous concern, not just having enough supply at the time you need it, but at a reasonable price. And what we know is we've built a manufacturing base in this country with energy being our competitive advantage, and that competitive advantage has disappeared. And so we're also mindful that our big manufacturing bases operate 24/7 and they need reliable dispatchable power 24/7, 365 days a year. And we are undoubtedly making a transition across, and I've said we should embrace both coal, both gas, and in the past I've said we should embrace nuclear. The reality, if you look at it in terms of investment dollars around the globe, of big financial institutions, money is going into more renewable sources of energy than it is in nuclear, than it is in coal, and it is in gas. I think there's an opportunity for Australia to embrace gas as we make the transition from coal, so we reduce our emissions profile. But what I also know is if we do have more renewables in Australia than others, and we do have other firm solutions like batteries and hydro, we should still be exploring gas to help other nations transition away from dirtier burning fuels. And that's not a conversation which is alive at the moment publicly, but if Australia uses less gas, but the world can reduce its emissions, particularly developing nations around Asia, Southeast Asia, by stop using black coal, brown coal, burning diesel, burning oil, and they can use gas as a cleaner fuel, then I think that is better for our globe as a whole. But that means we still have to continue exploring for gas in our backyard to create a cleaner environment around the globe. And the environmentalists want to kill me every time I say that.
Thank you, Mr. Walton. Although I'm a TWU member, I'm also a great supporter of the AWU and the work all you guys do. And big congratulations on your work since and you're announcing of stepping down as AWU secretary. I'm just curious that given the scale of the transformation for our economy, not just the resources sector, but also with like new industries expected to pop out in response to this. How do you see what do you think the AWU? What do you hope the AWU will push for into maintaining the like protections and fair pay and conditions for workers in these emerging industries and whatnot from the get-go?
Yeah. So what we know at the moment is that in a lot of the development of new renewable technologies, the jobs are being really short-term intermittent, and the long-term job profile is lower in comparison to traditional energy development. What we also know is there's an opportunity for us to try and explore manufacturing some of that renewable technology. Solar panels are gone. We still do have a chance for wind. I think you'll see some more announcements on that soon. And as I said, batteries is the big opportunity. We know in most economies is where you've got a good, stable manufacturing base, that you have a good jobs curve, like a good jobs profile, which is secure jobs at reasonable pay for long periods of time. So we know a lot of the renewable transition, that job profile goes up and down. What we're trying to do, like in New South Wales, the previous government and current government, they've got me as a chair of one of their boards, trying to create a tender structure which gives more onus and responsibility to proponents wanting to build these huge wind farms, solar farms, that they use more local content, more local labour to try and fix some of that problem. But frankly, if you look in terms of the number of people exiting out of those coal generation industries, we're going to need a lot more jobs created. And we just think that the manufacturing base, or a manufacturing opportunity to use the critical minerals, process them and make batteries out of them, will create a job multiplier which will more than amply secure employment for every one of those displaced workers.
Question from one of our Zoom, and it follows a bit of what you said previously, but given that China cannot be trusted to maintain supply chains in all circumstances, should we repeal the prohibition on nuclear energy and allow the construction of small modular reactors? I think you've written about this, but what's your position on that?
I wish, if I had a PowerPoint, I would show you this fantastic slide which gives you the picture. I've always been a supporter of nuclear. So I've said to you before, Gerard, I grew up, I still live in the Sutherland Shire, a stone's throw away from the only reactor in the country. And I often joke that I think I turned out okay. And so I don't believe in the sort of scaremongering side of things, but what I do believe is where investment dollars are going. And Australia, I think, had an opportunity to set up a nuclear industry here a couple of decades ago, and it missed. The previous government, if they were really serious, this is one bit I fundamentally agree with Chris Bowen on, if they were really serious about it, they had the opportunity to do something and progress on it, but they didn't. And right now, probably at least for the last decade, everyone's been saying scalable small modular reactors are going to be the future, but that's still yet to surface. When the graph I was talking about, if you look at it in the investment dollars in new forms of cleaner energy, which includes wind, so for wind towers, when you look at for solar panels, for batteries, for pumped hydro and for nuclear, nuclear, I think, is probably close to 1/100th of the total global investment dollars that are getting flowed in at the moment. And so I do think the race is running ahead of nuclear. But if things change, I'm pragmatic enough to say that we should explore it if the genuine opportunity is there.
Okay, Daniel. We've just heard that the Quad won't be meeting and the President won't be coming and to our part of the world, President of the United States, and that's because they have to raise the debt ceiling. And what you're describing is going on in the United States is terrific, but it's costing them an arm and a leg.
Yep.
If you sort of sell that to the Australian government, what chance have you got of asking them to raise the debt ceiling to that extent? And what's happening in America may be great, but it's also sucking from Europe, from Britain, from all the advanced economies, the talent that's there. So they're getting anxious about the fact that they can't find the employees they need for their own projects.
Yep.
So how do we compete with the big gorilla in the room?
Yeah, so I'd start backwards. So as a consequence, all of those nations are putting in place similar policies to try to at least match or create a stable footprint like the United States. In terms of the United States, in terms of the debt position, Taylor is here as our national economist. We'll find 100 reasons to say why what I'm about to say is stupid. And this is really controversial, right? I think most people at this point in time are not massively concerned about the debt levels that governments have. I don't think that is a determinant factor in elections in this country, nor is it in the United States. So I also look at it in terms of the amount of debt Australians hold in comparison to the rest of the world, and we love debt. And so personally, most people in this room and around the country are loaded with debts of various forms. And I don't think it's something that we're particularly anxious about. And so I think if the government was to lean in, the Australian government was to lean in heavily and say, yes, we are going to take on a bit more exposure here because we know this is very important for decades to come, I don't think the Australian people would blink an eye.
Yes, the COVID is a very interesting event because after COVID, Australia suddenly realized, we have a supply chain problem because, like a very basic, like mask, we don't have enough, yep. And so it is not the scarcity of minerals, but it's the scarcity of manufacturing capacity. And the situation actually getting worse because I couldn't get a copy paper last week. The A4 paper, most post office run out. So your solution basically, you want all the manufacturing coming back to Australia. But compared to America, it's a lot more difficult because America itself is domestically, it's a huge market. So for investors to establish the manufacturing industry, Australia is a very small market. So that's why all the car company left Australia because you don't have. Because you mentioned about the one of your solution is basically foreigners can take a lot of equities in minerals companies, but we're not having anything. We don't demand anything from them. But what about we should take equity in their manufacturing?
Okay.
Because in that case, we can secure the supply just in
case.
There's
a question about
COVID.
equity in manufacturing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think of the best way to answer this. I think, no country in the world has become advanced or a leader in something without government creating a whole lot of settings to say this is a key area that we want to drive and focus in. If you look at every nation where you go, they are a leader in X, Y, and Z, it is because they have put together all of their policy settings at state and federal levels to say this is where we want to excel. What we are trying to say is we're not saying stop foreign investment. We're not saying that at all. We're saying we have to be very more careful about what happens about those minerals that get dug up and where they go. We're essentially saying you should create the settings here to both make it difficult, but also incentivise people to process here. And that should be an area that the government wants to excel in going forward.
Thank you, Daniel. You mentioned critical minerals. Could I ask, does the same equation apply to hydrogen, and whether we're just going to manufacture hydrogen and just ship it somewhere else, or whether processing of hydrogen into ammonia and so forth might be a similar opportunity?
That's a very good question, and something that we have spoken about before, because the only scalable hydrogen production that's happening at the moment is down in Victoria in Latrobe, and it's ending up on a ship and heading to Japan. And everyone talks about the great hydrogen opportunity in the same way as they talked about the great gas opportunity. But again, if we don't have any foresight about where the product is going to end up, you question what the advantage will be for us as a nation. More and more I hear about the technical challenges about the transportation around hydrogen, but there is definitely more and more people leaning into it. The timeframes for success, I think, are the bit which Australians and the public, and I think the media, don't present a true picture. Everything is assumed it's on a flick of a switch basis. We'll go from this to this to this to this. And the reality is it doesn't happen. You speak to our companies who work in the steel industry, right? We spend a lot of time with them, and they talk about the amount of time to be able to transition to a green steel opportunity, which for them is mid-2030 plus. And so everyone assumes, well, we're going to start having green steel pretty soon. And I think there's just a certain element here, like hydrogen and others, which is just about setting expectations, but also not just setting expectations, thinking about, well, what will happen if we don't have the necessary policy parameters in place? I am sure, but mark my words here about critical minerals, but also about hydrogen. If the government doesn't put in place, which it has not for any hydrogen facility which has been green-lighted at the moment, they do not have any export arrangements in place. And I think with that, you'll see the vast majority of hydrogen created going to benefit the rest of the world and not Australia.
Daniel, thanks for the speech. This might be a bit out of your wheelhouse, but I just wondered if you had any views based on talking to your members and their employers on carbon capture and storage. Just, is that viable? Just today, there's been a bit of differing views on that. I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it is definitely viable. It's funny, we had a conversation with someone just a couple of weeks ago when they were on a government tour over in Germany, I think it was, and they were showing, I'm not going to pretend to put on the German accent, but they did a very good German accent, and they were sort of explaining the technology they had to be able to capture and process that carbon. And they were sort of saying, like, this is not a question. The technology's here and the technology's now. If you look up in the oil fields off Norway, you'll see they pumped millions of tonnes of CO2 back into those wells. I think it is either Gorgon, I'll stand corrected on that. Gorgon has got a project up in the Northwest Shelf, which has got CCS operating right now. I think what we've been trying to say to the Minister is this is an opportunity here for Australia to be able to get large-scale reductions in our carbon footprint, being able to capture it and put it underground. I think there's just a little bit more to do to convince the government that it is a real and genuine opportunity. And the other bit is CCS really benefits a lot of the gas operators, and there is a general collective view, which is those same operators have been making billions and billions and billions of dollars. If they want to make it work, they can spend their own money doing it.
Daniel John Kunkel from the US Study Centre. Thanks for your speech. You framed what I think you can see as a pretty controversial policy proposal in part very squarely around national security and interdependence with China. Do you think if the government were to pick up this proposal, they will need to equally frame it in those terms to the Australian people, given that obviously Don Farrell's been up in Beijing and there's a steady stream of other expectant visitors to Beijing in coming months?
I think the easy solution to that, John, is if we start more and more and more rare earth and critical mineral mines are going to get opened up. If we don't put a policy in place, export arrangements will be locked in, and then everyone will say it's too hard to break them. So what we're trying to say is let's pause now, before we open up any others, let's get in place the policy settings to make sure that we're trying to get the benefit here. I think there will be a bunch of people say, don't make this about China. You'll notice the Koreans were out just the other day saying to us, good old Australians, you're good with a shovel, you're not good with anything else. Just stick to the shovel, don't do anything else, which I thought was just completely and utterly rude. But I think that's what we're dealing with, right? Everyone's saying, you just stick to playing in the dirt and we can manufacture all the stuff, keep sending it to us. What we're trying to say is, if Australia wants true economic security and sovereign capability, critical minerals and rare earths are going to play a massive part of our future. If we allow it all to go overseas, we don't have control of it. And so we're just saying, whether it's China has invested the most in because they are smarter than us, they look longer into the distance and they can see how important this is, and that's why they are tipping in massively to try and buy up our key deposits at the moment. But it doesn't mean that we have to accept that going forward.
Just a final question. Treasurer Jim Chalmers spoke well about you today in reports in the media. And was that before or after he read your speech?
Jim and I had a conversation very early yesterday morning, and he said it publicly, so I don't mind saying it. We are good friends. We have very significant differences on the football teams we support. And our banter back and forth is certainly not for public consumption on the thoughts of each other's team. But he's been a really good friend and a very good supporter, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to support him in his role, getting in as treasurer. And yesterday morning we had a conversation, and I started the chat primarily about the speech, and he said, I'm not interested in talking about that. I'm interested in why you have not told me that you wanted to go. And so, I think the government at the moment is saying we're just going to keep our powder dry until we release our critical minerals report. We're just using this as an opportunity to really shape the debate in the lead up to the ALP National Conference and through the National Policy Forum. And hopefully, I will be gone before those meetings are held. But if we're unsuccessful in that claim, I just think it's going to lead to bad outcomes for the country in the future.
Many thanks. So, many thanks to Danny Walton for a stimulating talk at the Sydney Institute. We've had previous AWU National Secretaries here, Bill Shorten, Paul Howes, yourself, and the late good friend of the Institute, Laurie Short, who was in the Iron Workers, who went into the Australian Workers' Union, I think. Yep. So we'll hope to have the next one, and good luck in your next career. But for tonight, well done. You've stimulated all of us and made us think, and that's what we're here for. Well done. Thank you.